U.S. History Review, The Emergence of the United States and the Americas in Global Affairs. This includes some things before World War I, World War I, and it has events that take place after World War I, including a little bit of the 1920s and 30s and World War II. So this is a quick review. We're going to do this one quickly today. You have on the screen some of the terms that have been tested before, bolded or you must know. Underlined is you should know too, because, for example, the last Regent's essay was on prohibition and the 18th Amendment. They could certainly do almost any of these topics, not just for a multiple choice question. That's why you want to know things, even if it's not the right answer to the question. Let's go and see what's going on. Specifically, the Spanish-American War in 1898, a splendid little war, was often described as America's experiment in imperialism, right? The USA not only taking a more aggressive foreign policy, but an aggressive foreign policy against weaker nations, absorbing places like Puerto Rico and also Guam, and annexing Hawaii as part of the war effort. And then there's the Philippines. So you have a lot of U.S. intervention in this time period. This is the stuff of deep historical research. Should be up there as well as Panama Canal is often tested. Some of these are more tested than others. For example, there's been very little ever about the Honduran intervention, but a lot about the Spanish-American War. So this is true that prior to the Spanish-American War, the U.S. was exerting some influence over the Caribbean, but the real key is that the U.S. started to intervene militarily in the Caribbean, right? Like, you should know, intervention often equals direct use of a nation's military in another country. And that term, like interventionism or intervention or advocating for intervention, that's going to be talking about specifically utilizing the military. The U.S. is not into colonization, even in this imperialist time period, and the real key here is that the U.S. did gain greater reputation as a world power during this time period. There's a few other events that ought to be known here, and I'm actually going to make sure that we include these here later on as well. You're looking at certain types of U.S. diplomacy. You're looking at number one, big stick diplomacy, which you'll see in the political cartoon. This is military policy, use of force and threats. You have dollar diplomacy. This is economic policy, use of loans and trade agreements, backed up with military policy oftentimes. And then you have moral diplomacy. This is a bit of both, but it's supposed to be diplomatic policy and encouragement of democracies and American values overseas, but utilizing economic and military policy as well. The real key that you should know here is that for these policies, they are associated with different presidents, right? So this is President Teddy Roosevelt. For big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy is Taft, and moral diplomacy is Wilson. Then you have some changes to the U.S. after World War I. These questions are not in order. I'm going to put them in order before we do this. Here is Teddy with the aforementioned big stick in the Caribbean Sea. I'm going to actually move this down to our group right here. Here we go. This is really the key. This is sometimes also called oh my goodness. This is sometimes also called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. You should know that U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere was created first and strongest as an interventionist policy by President James Monroe in the 1820s. That is a predecessor to these here. Yeah, this needs to change. Here we go. Okay. But the U.S. is seen as being the protector of the Western Hemisphere. That was also true in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was more about anti-colonial foreign policy, right? That new colonies should not be established in the Americas. We'll have to go back up to some of these others, but let's keep them in chronological order for a little bit. Nope. World War One. Nope. After the war. Nope. 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 Oh, wait. Maybe it looks like we are going to be in order here in a minute. All right. We're in order. So, back on up. Here we go. After World War I, the United States had several crises. The time period after World War I was a tumultuous time for the United States. Economically, socially, and politically. Here you're talking about there's the case against the Reds. This is part of the first Red Scare. And during the First World War, the Russian royal family was assassinated, and the Bolshevik Revolution took place, replacing them with a socialist, Marxist, Leninist, communist democracy. You should also have some notes on who some certain titles are. The Attorney General is the U.S. Federal Chief Attorney, like a prosecutor attorney, often therefore against different criminal elements in the United States. Palmer is well known as a conservative here. He was a very conservative opponent of communism and radicalism, and he also was pretty racist. Let's just call it what it is. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. So this was the key, right? There was this nativist sentiment that Nativism 2.0, the communist and anarchist elements were coming from other countries, right? It was felt that immigrants were bringing these undesirable political beliefs to the USA. This is going to relate to a question here in a minute. And this is related to the end of the World War I, or also known as the First Red Scare. The Second Red Scare is going to be after World War II. So Red Scare 1 after World War I, Second Red Scare after World War II. You can keep that in the bag right there. You should also know a couple of things here as well. The government was critical of dissent during World War I. The government did limit freedom of speech and freedom of the press during World War I, and also prosecuted people who avoided the draft. And so Palmer did not like many of these people here, but here he's talking about communists and anarchists. The Treaty of Versailles, you should know, this Treaty of Versailles at 1919 into 1920 was, it's sort of an overtime era here, is the treaty that ended World War I. The USA helped draft this treaty, but then did not ratify it. So you should know some terms, even if they're not the answers to questions on the Regents exam this time, because they certainly might be. There was once an entire essay on the Treaty of Versailles and the ratification process. Remember, you should remember, please, presidents can enter treaties, my goodness spelling, but Senate must ratify, right? That's the process. That's how it goes. This Immigration Act of 1924 is an anti-immigrant effort as well. This established quotas to limit immigration. We'll actually talk about that in a quick second here, because, right, like, it's not the answer this time, but it might be, and it will be. Here it is in this one. But first, also during the war, you should know that women were agitating for the right to the vote in the United States for quite a long time, and during World War I, they got what they wanted. There's a couple other notes here as we go back in time chronologically. Number one, suffragists is a term for female suffrage proponents. And you should also know that German submarine warfare was the number one cause of the U.S. entering World War I. It was not really the Zimmerman telegram, even though that came chronologically right before. It was actually the resumption of submarine warfare. You should know a couple of these things as well. Like, you should know what prohibition is. See the previous video. You should now know what the 14 points are. I'm going to tell you this one really, really quickly as well. This was Wilson's plan for the post-World War I world. It involved the proposed League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN. And this was a component, the one component really, of the Treaty of Versailles that Wilson really fought for and was included in the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was also one of the major reasons why the Senate refused to ratify it. That was a whole essay, believe it or not. Some other things here as well. You should know that this was on my Regents exam back in the day. Langston Hughes was a African American poet, playwright, artist extravaganza in the Harlem Renaissance. He, like many others, came to New York and profited during the Roaring 1920s, making a lot of great artwork, poetry, and screenplays, and there was music and other stuff beyond. This was also a very good and artistic criticism of racial segregation and other societal problems in the United States, right? You should know the Harlem Renaissance was a huge population uptick in NYC and an accompanying economic boom in the city's black districts. This is well chronicled in New York City as being associated with jazz, as being associated with speakeasies after Prohibition arrives, and being a very major player in black culture, becoming well recognized as a part of U.S. culture. The key here for this question about what concept is best illustrated, I'm going to leave you to figure this one out. Other people have argued about this, that he is advocating not only racial pride, but, for example, not patriotism or nationalism, because although this is an element of the poem here, these two terms are the same thing, so you can't have both terms being the answer to the question. This is an example of the Harlem Renaissance. The Lost Generation were writers and artists, especially writers though, of the 1920s as well. Frequently tested back in the earlier days of the Regents. Now, immigration to the United States was at a then all-time high from Europe. So the United States passed these quota acts. The goal of this nativist anti-immigrant push was limits would be set based on current / past amounts, percentages really, of peoples already in the U.S. So, for example, 3% gate, meaning 3% of 3% of the current population from Hungary can come to the United States. Oh, we don't have any Hungarians. Well, I guess 3% of 0 is 0 new Hungarians. 3% of immigrants from France. Well, we have 300,000 immigrants from France. Well, looks like, right, like the number was to try to keep the status quo by limiting the amounts based off of who was already in here, right? This really tried to continue the status quo of who was there, right? More immigrants can come from places that already had large populations, was the goal. This is not about assistance. They're not giving them any help necessarily in the United States, and this is not necessarily about tariff rates. These are also not refugees. It's not open immigration. It's not cultural diversity. It's the exact opposite. The issue was many Europeans coming from countries like Italy and Eastern Europe. That was the goal that wanted to be limited. Now we're going to switch here into some of the domestic stuff on the Great Depression. Specifically over here, if you see the word dust, it is the Dust Bowl. Do not think further than that. This is really the main impact here. So you should know that the Dust Bowl created the impact of many families being forced to migrate out west. Settlements were not banned. However, you should know that this was largely on the Great Plains, areas west of the Mississippi River. And what New Deal action attempted to address the causes of the situation? You need to know a couple of different New Deal programs. The CCC was a, as it says, conservation program. You should know again, review from last time, conservation equals environmental protection. But there are other New Deal programs, like the SEC equals stock market regulation. A major cause of the Depression was easy credit, or buying stock on margin, that led to the Great Depression. So you should know that depending on what problem is exerted here, you're going to have different answers. This could have been someone complaining about not having any money after they retired, after having worked several years in the United States. This was the Social Security, right? This was a reform effort to guarantee retirement savings for elderly Americans. And boy, did it get expensive. You also should know another problem of the Great Depression was the bank runs, right? After the stock market collapse of 1929, many banks simply ran out. So the FDIC and bank holidays and a few other programs like FIRA were created to stop future bank collapses. If the bank runs out of your money, it is not going to be getting more money in the future, is it? So you should know some of these acronyms here. Like, yes, they should probably tell you FDIC equals Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, but you should know for yourself. You should also know that the unemployment of the Great Depression was greatly reduced by not the New Deal, but World War II, right? World War II did more to end the Great Depression than the New Deal programs did. The New Deal programs helped, possibly they were very useful, but they were not the key. The goal here is that in this cartoon, you should know that in January of 1943, the USA is not yet in World War II. They're helping the Allies against the Axis powers by manufacturing weapons, but they are not a part of the fighting yet. This is why the answer here is D. You should also really know Allies equals UK, USSR, France, China, and eventually USA. And the Axis equals a large, among others, Nazi Germany, Japan, Italy, and a few more. Love some of these political cartoons here. These World War II posters encouraged Americans to support home front war efforts, right? The home front is within civilian USA, right? And the goal here is, or a historian would find this document most useful, It's not necessarily about lying, but how it could gain civilian support during this time period. You also have a couple of things that happened during the war, like the internment of Japanese Americans. You should know there was a Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States. You should know that the majority opinion is the winning side. The dissenting opinion equals the losing side's opinion. But these are important to know because after getting a document like this, they might ask you, what was the result? It's going to be the opposite of the dissenting opinion. It's going to be a continuation of the logic from the majority opinion. Both of these are talking about reasons why the Japanese Americans were interned or forcefully relocated in these camps during World War II in the USA. And both of these documents note that public opinion, as it might be, is not always correct in favor of removing these Japanese Americans against their constitutional rights to internment camps during the war. The Korematsu case this is the case of if internment camps would be constitutional or not. And, like a bunch of fools they were, the Supreme Court determined that it was. Well, ain't that grand? No, it's not. The answer is no, it's not grand. Also, equally upsetting is the U.S. knowledge of the Holocaust prior to involvement in World War II, and I would say even more so during the war, impacting and not impacting U.S. military policy. This is the stuff of a whole entire history IA. The idea was that the United States did have credible information about what was happening during the Holocaust, but didn't find it worthwhile to mobilize a military effort because of this. They waited till the U.S. was attacked during Pearl Harbor. U.S. only entered World War II because of Pearl Harbor, December 1943. That the U.S. could have intervened earlier to stop the Holocaust, and I would add, including during the war, making a more sustained push in Northern Europe versus Southern Europe. Churchill's on that one too. But don't get political. Just learn what happened so that you can get better results next time. After the war, Roosevelt's widow, Eleanor Roosevelt, was a member of the newly formed UN. The key here is that the United Nations was created as a sort of, hey, we screwed this up with not joining the League of Nations. The United Nations was one part of the U.S. international effort to secure world peace and prosperity after World War II. There are a few other things like the General Agreement Against Tariffs, the IMF and the World Bank. Those don't often come up on the Regents exam. But if you see Eleanor Roosevelt's speech on Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you should be thinking about the UN. You should know that this is a reaction to the Holocaust and other genocides by the Axis powers during World War II. That wraps it up for us here today. There's a lot more to learn. You're sitting here saying we never saw Navajo code talkers, and we didn't really get into, yeah, I know, court packing plan could be an entire essay, but make sure you study some of these terms, let me know what questions you have, and come back for the next multiple choice review soon.